The chamber was cold, not with the chill of winter, but with the pervasive, bone-deep cold of ancient, forgotten stone and violated oaths. Serafina knelt on the obsidian floor, her joints protesting with a dry, clicking sound that was lost beneath the low, incessant hum emanating from the altar. She was dressed in heavy Mothaton velvets, their richness long faded to the color of dried blood, a deliberate mimicry of the old ritual garb. In her trembling hands, she held a silver basin, its surface etched with glyphs that pulsed faintly with a sickly violet light. Inside the basin lay the offering, a small, intricately carved wooden figure, perfect in every detail, representing a life yet to be lived. This was the night of the seventh cycle, the culmination of a family pact that had spanned 3 centuries and demanded 6 previous, terrible payments. Serafina wished for silence, but the chamber had its own terrible music, the drip of stagnant water, the whisper of air through unseen vents, and the terrifying promise of the approaching entity. Above the altar rested the Chronos amulet, the heart of the curse, a dull bronze disc that looked deceptively harmless in the flickering candlelight. It was the artifact that gave the Lane family their power, the brief, catastrophic ability to rewind moments, to undo small mistakes, to seize fleeting advantage. But temporal manipulation always demands an impossible price, and tonight the bill was due in full, no extensions allowed. Seraphine's great-grandfather had been the first. He used the amulet to save a shipment of silk, gaining immense wealth but losing his firstborn son to the pact. Her grandfather had reversed a market crash, securing the family's fortune. But the second offering was his own beloved wife. Her father, the last to wield the power, merely used it to win a frivolous bet, demonstrating the triviality into which the immense dark power had descended. He had been a careless wielder, and his lack of respect for the contract only amplified the entity's eventual hunger. Serafina herself had only used the amulet once, in a moment of panic, to prevent a glass vial of priceless family documents from shattering. The minor reversal had brought her no great fortune, but it had irrevocably committed her to fulfilling the 7th and final term of the dreadful bargain. The air grew suddenly thick, as if the very atoms in the chamber had become weighted down with sorrow and malice. The humming from the altar stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound like dry leaves skittering across polished marble, though there was no breeze. From the darkest corner of the room, a form began to solidify, not rising from the ground, but pulling itself together from the ambient shadow. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, clad in robes of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb the light, rendering his features indistinct. This was Malachi, the collector, the intermediary appointed by the void to manage its endless soul-consuming contracts. He moved without sound, without effort, gliding across the floor until he stood directly opposite Serafina, the altar between them. Malachi's presence radiated cold patience, the terrible patience of something that has existed since the universe was young. "Serafina Lane?" His voice was a dry, rasping whisper, like sand falling through an hourglass made of brittle bone. "The cycle is complete." Serafina struggled to hold his gaze, which felt less like sight and more like an assessment of her internal rot. "The offering is prepared, Malachi," she managed, her voice cracking against the unyielding solemnity of the ritual. She held up the silver basin, presenting the perfectly crafted wooden figurine, a symbol of potential and innocence. Malachi tilted his head, a gesture of almost human curiosity that was unsettling on his shadowy form. "A representation of a life," he stated, his voice flat. "Symbolism, Serafina, is only acceptable when the pact has been honored with truth." The realization struck Serafina with sickening force. He knew the offering was merely a substitute, a desperate forgery. "The 6th offering," Malachi continued, his voice hardening, "was carelessly handled by your father, rendering the subsequent cycle unstable. The pact requires a soul of equal or greater value to the power consumed," he explained, a profound disappointment in his tone. "But your father's use was so trivial, so wasteful, that the void demanded a recalibration of the final decisive payment." Serafina dropped her gaze. She knew her father had tried to substitute a stolen gem for the 6th soul, and the collector had taken him instead. The contract's inherent demand was not for a soul but for power, which the void converted into usable energy for its own endless, cold machinations. "The terms for the 7th offering were explicitly clear to your father before his untimely departure," Malachi hissed. The final payment must resolve the entire debt and secure the remaining power of the amulet. Forever. He gestured toward the amulet, and the bronze disc began to vibrate violently, emitting a high-pitched whine. The Chronos amulet is spent, Serafina. Its power is now a hungry vortex, not a gift. It wants repayment, not potential. I understood the payment was the most cherished possession of the current wielder, Serafina whispered, trying to recall the archaic wording of the original contract. And what precisely is your most cherished possession? Malachi asked, a cruel smile forming in the darkness of his features. Is it this carved wood? A token of a life you have no intention of sacrificing? His assessment was brutal and accurate. Seraphine's most cherished possession was the dusty ledger containing the complete history of her family's downfall, the terrifying truth that kept her grounded. But she could not offer knowledge to the void. The void knew everything already. She looked at the amulet, remembering the fleeting, intoxicating sensation of reversing time, if only by a few seconds. The power was addictive, and the power was the source of her family's ruin, their greatest asset and their greatest shame. Malachi's patience was visibly thinning, the shadows around him intensifying, making the chamber feel dangerously small. The terms, simplified for a mortal mind, are this. The void demands an offering of memory, identity, or purpose, he intoned slowly. Something that defines the you that stands before me, a true, irreplaceable piece of your soul's architecture. Seraphine's breath hitched. Her life had been consumed by the amulet's history, her identity forged in the shadow of the pact. She had no purpose other than breaking the cycle, fulfilling the final payment to prevent the curse from consuming the rest of the world. The amulet must be retired, she declared, her voice now gaining a surprising strength born of absolute desperation. I offer you the concept of the Lane family lineage. I offer the erasure of the entire pact from history. Malachi let out a soundless laugh that somehow conveyed amusement and scorn simultaneously. The void does not accept retroactive edits, Serafina. It deals in irreversible transactions. You can only offer what is truly yours to relinquish. And the family history is merely borrowed from the past. Her thoughts raced, frantically searching for the one thing she held sacred, the one thing that defined her existence outside of the curse. There was only one thing left, one truth she had hidden even from herself. Her secret, the hidden power she had nurtured, was the ability to feel hope in the face of certain doom. Hope was the most potent, most valuable currency to an entity that thrives on despair. She straightened her spine, meeting Malachi's terrifying gaze with a newfound steely resolve. I offer my future, Serafina announced, the declaration echoing strangely in the oppressive silence of the room. I offer the entirety of my remaining existence not as a servant, but as an infinite, unchangeable moment of despair. Take my capacity for change, for growth, for joy take, everything that makes tomorrow worth enduring. This was the true, ultimate sacrifice, to live forever in the moment of finality, frozen in the realization of her failure. Malachi paused, his shadowy form seeming to consider the unprecedented nature of her final desperate bid. The void preferred souls, clean and simple, but this offered a constant, renewable source of concentrated futility. A bold, if pathetic offering, Malachi conceded, his voice almost intrigued, a permanent stasis of soul. The amulet must be inert, afterward. The contract must terminate with me, Serafina insisted, forcing the final term of her negotiation. Agreed, Malachi replied, and the single word was heavier and more binding than 1,000 pages of legal script. The shadows around him began to writhe, extending tendrils of absolute darkness toward the Chronos amulet. The bronze disc screamed, a sound that was less audible and more a vibration in the chest cavity, a horrifying expulsion of stored power. Serafina watched, unable to look away, as the amulet began to rapidly age, turning from bronze to ash, shrinking into nothingness. The tendrils of darkness converged, not upon the wooden figurine, but upon Serafina herself, reaching for her heart. The cold intensified, becoming unbearable, like being submerged in liquid nitrogen, every nerve ending screaming in protest. She felt the process begin, the excision of potential, the surgical removal of the idea that things might ever be better. The memories of her last moments of genuine happiness as sunset, a kind word from a stranger, were painfully ripped away. She remembered her first kiss, the pure, foolish hope of young love. And then the memory was gone, leaving a blank space in her consciousness. She felt her sense of purpose to save the world from her family's curse fade into a pointless academic exercise. When the darkness retreated, Serafina felt physically empty, like an exhausted vessel that had been entirely drained. Malachi stood before her, the Void's contract now complete, the ritual successful but devastating. "It is done, Serafina Lane. The Chronos amulet is no more. The debt is settled," Malachi announced with finality. "We're free from the pact, but you are also free from the burdensome concept of tomorrow." He picked up the silver basin, which was now empty, placing it on the altar as a ceremonial act of closure. Serafina tried to feel fear or relief or even despair, but found only a profound, crystalline stillness. She rose slowly, her body moving with the heavy, unhurried grace of a clock that has stopped ticking. The chamber was no longer cold. It was utterly neutral, lacking any quality of sensation, either positive or negative. Malachi dissolved back into the shadows, his presence simply unraveling from existence without a trace. Serafina stood alone, the last of the Lane line, victorious, yet utterly defeated by the unholy pact. She walked to the spot where the amulet had rested, and found only a fine powder of ancient, useless ash. The curse was broken, but the breaking had required the complete and final sacrifice of her own capacity for a future. She looked at her hands and realized they no longer felt like hers. They were merely tools for performing endless, monotonous tasks. The taste of the air, the feel of the velvet, the memory of her name all were detached, observed rather than experienced. The true horror of the Void's bargain was not death, but the eternal, chilling realization that nothing would ever surprise her again. Serafina opened the chamber door and stepped out into the world, a ghost of her former self, bound to live a life without trajectory. The greatest cursed object was not the amulet, but the memory of the hope she had traded away for finality. Her pact was honored, but the cost was an existence that was perfect, predictable, and utterly, horribly empty. It was the most terrible truth. The Void takes not life, but the meaning of life. Thank you for watching this tale of a terrible bargain. If you were chilled by Seraphine's sacrifice, leave a comment below. Like this video, share it with a fellow dark fantasy enthusiast, and subscribe to Storycraft Studio for more tales of cursed objects and unholy pacts.